Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fred Stennis, Supervisor for the Awareness and Outreach Group here at Federal Student Aid. And I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for registering and joining today's special webinar entitled FAFSA Corrections, Unusual and Special Financial Circumstances. But before we get started, please take note of the following disclaimer. The information presented today is on background and not for direct attribution. For comment about the information presented today, please contact press@ed.gov. Now, a few housekeeping notes. A recording of today's presentation will be available within 24 hours on our YouTube channel, which is at FSA Outreach. You can also request a PDF version of the PowerPoint slides in the description below. If you have questions about today's presentation content, feel free to enter it into the chat and one of our representatives will respond. There will also be an opportunity to address some of the questions during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Closed captioning is available by clicking on at the bottom right side of your screen where you will see a gear icon. Click on it and then click on Subtitle On and then click on Subtitle Option, and there will be a list of languages that include Spanish, French, Chinese, Hindu, Arabic, etc. Please choose your preferred language to listen to the webinar. Now that we've taken care of the logistics, let's begin. Today's presenter will be none other than Mr. David Barnicki, Senior Program Specialist representing Federal Student Aid Policy Implementation Oversight. We're so glad he accepted the invitation to be with us today. And now, at this time, let's begin. Let me turn it over to David. David, take it away.
Thanks, Fred, and welcome everyone to today's session on FAFSA corrections, unusual and special financial circumstances. As you can see in the agenda, we have quite a lot of information we want to cover and some areas that we want to highlight specific to the free application for federal student aid, otherwise known as the FAFSA form. Since we only have an hour, let's go ahead and get started. I want to start with some highlights and information related to the 2025-26 FAFSA form. It is important for all of my students and families out there today to remember that it's important to know which award year and which FAFSA form you want to be filling out specific to the year in question. Currently, those in school are in the 24-25 year. The 25-26 FAFSA processing began in December of 2024. Since there are times where you can have overlapping award year periods, it's important when you're filling out the FAFSA form to make sure you're filling out the correct year. Any questions about the FAFSA form as far as what you should be filling out for certain school periods, I encourage you to discuss that with your financial aid office. I mentioned the FAFSA form, the free application, and you're going to hear us talk about that time and time again through today's session. That application is very important because it's the beginning of the federal student aid process. By filling out that form, the student has access potentially to various forms of federal student aid, including grant, federal work study, and loan funds. As you can see on this slide, last year over $120 billion was awarded and provided to our various students at the post-secondary level. Now, I need to stress that the application itself, the FAFSA form, is just the beginning of the process. It does not by itself indicate that you are going to be, in fact, eligible for federal student aid. The institution, the school, the trade career institute that you end up going to is going to work with you and review your information to make sure that you are eligible for federal student aid. Aside from the FAFSA form, there are many basic eligibility requirements students must meet in order to be eligible for federal student aid. On this slide, you can see a couple examples of some key areas where eligibility needs to occur. If you're receiving need-based federal student aid, such as a federal Pell Grant, you will need to demonstrate financial need. You need to be a U.S. citizen or eligible non-citizen. You need to be maintaining or making satisfactory academic progress throughout your academic career, and so forth. For a complete list and more information related to this, you can feel free to visit the studentaid.gov link listed at the bottom of the slide. So it's important to remember the FAFSA begins the process. You have to meet basic eligibility for both student and program requirements. Here we go a little bit further into citizens eligibility. Just as an example, you have to be a U.S. citizen or eligible non-citizen. We will match information provided to us on the FAFSA form with various federal agencies such as Social Security, such as Immigration, Department of Homeland Security, so that we can verify whether the student is in fact a U.S. citizen or eligible non-citizen. When we talk about eligible non-citizens, you can see on this slide several examples of what is eligible. If you're a permanent resident or a conditional permanent resident, if you're a refugee, asylee, a parolee, if you're a resident of freely associated states or a Canadian-born Native American. So we have certain immigration statuses that in fact allow someone to be eligible for federal Title IV aid. However, on the right-hand side of the slide, you will also see several categories of non-citizens that are not eligible for federal student aid. Student visas, for instance, or if the family or student is here under a U visa. Also, if you are here as a deferred action for childhood arrivals, otherwise known as a DACA person or DACA student, you would not be eligible for federal student aid. However, I do stress, just because a particular status may not allow you to get federal student aid, it's never a bad idea to check with your financial aid office to see if possible there's some state or school aid that might be available to your situation. Now, you're going to hear me refer to studentaid.gov quite a bit. Studentaid.gov is the website for our students and families and parents to become familiar with, especially as it relates to federal student aid. To begin the process of filling out your FAFSA form, one of the key things you're going to want to do is set up a studentaid.gov account, otherwise known as an FSA ID. This account is going to follow you from year to year and is very important because it will allow you to gain access to various ed systems, and it will allow you to electronically sign various education documents, including, and maybe most importantly, your FAFSA form. Now, as you can see on the slide, it's also very important to realize that anybody who has to contribute data to your FAFSA form, a student, a parent, a spouse, if you're an independent student, you need to make sure that all of you have your own studentaid.gov accounts. Please don't share this information. This is your specific account. It is your signature that will be used throughout the various education applications that it would apply. As you can also see on the slide, if you haven't created an account and you need to do so, you can do that through studentaid.gov. The link is provided here. And note that it does take a couple of days typically to verify who you are. Remember, we're verifying the information provided so that we can make sure that you are who you say you are, because going forward, this is going to be your electronic footprint for federal student aid. It's also important to remember that on studentaid.gov, there are certain key resources that can assist you as you are walking through the FAFSA process. Students sometimes have questions about which parent to include on the FAFSA form. And though that may sound very simple, how could you not know who your parent is for purposes of reporting on the form? We do have lots of situations that might include divorces, separations, parents who never got married. And so students may have some legitimate questions about who that parent is. This wizard, this parent wizard, can assist you in just a few minutes helping to determine which parent information should be included on the FAFSA form. One thing we did for the 25-26 FAFSA is we started adding additional warnings and bringing up information regarding consent and approval. Starting in the 2024-25 award year, every single person who puts information on the FAFSA form, every contributor, has to provide consent and approval to have their information sent to the IRS. If you do not provide consent and approval, if any contributor that's required to provide data on the FAFSA form, such as a parent, such as a spouse, does not provide consent and approval, ultimately the student's FAFSA form will be rejected and that student will not be eligible for federal student aid. So we want to make sure that as you're going through this process, if you did not check, if you did not indicate consent and approval, we're going to keep telling the individuals throughout the process, hey, don't forget you didn't check the consent and approval. Hey, don't you want to check consent and approval? Remember, if you don't, the student's not going to be eligible for federal student aid. And so I really want to pause here and make a point, especially to our parents out there today, that remember, anybody who provides information on the FAFSA form, it's simply being used to help determine the types and amounts of federal student aid that a student may be eligible for. It in no way obligates the parent or spouse, for that matter, to pay for or provide any financial support to the student for their post-secondary career. So it's just information that's going to be utilized. This is not a loan application. This is not a payment application. So I just want to stress that by obtaining your information, we're simply going to use that to help determine the types and amounts of aid that the student can receive. As you're going through, as you're preparing to fill out your FAFSA form, this slide walks through some basic areas that can assist you in that process. Remember, get that studentaid.gov account established. Do that before you begin the FAFSA form. If there's any issues, that can get resolved ahead of time, because remember, that's how you're going to ultimately sign and provide that information through the online process. Make sure you know who your contributors are. Are you a dependent student where you're going to have parental information? Are you an independent student who's married and will have to provide some spousal information? Do you have your financial information together? Do you know what schools you would like this FAFSA information to be sent to? All of that can help in the process of filling out your FAFSA form. Overall, it takes less than an hour if you have all of your information gathered and you've done your preparation to fill out and submit the FAFSA form. And think about this. This is only done once a year. So for the thousands of dollars the student might gain access to, this hour or so is very important in that progression through higher education and gaining access to those programs that the student's interested in. And obviously this opens the door to financial aid, but it's important to remember, I said, the FAFSA form is the beginning process to gain access to federal student aid, such as the federal Pell Grant, federal direct loans, federal work study, federal supplemental educational opportunity grant, the TEACH grant, but it also potentially opens the door to access to other aid. Some states or schools require the FAFSA form to be filled out so they have an idea of all the types of aid the student might be eligible for. So don't forget, the grants, the scholarships, the work studies, and the loans are not just federal based, but you potentially have access to state aid, school aid, private aid. And if you have questions about the types of aid that your student may be eligible to access at a particular institution, the best resource is to set up an appointment with the financial aid office. If you call the Department of Education, we can help you on the federal side, but understand we don't know what that school offers as far as financial aid at the school level. We don't necessarily know what you're going to be eligible for at the state level, or what types of private aid a lot of the students at that particular institution may access. So again, work with your financial aid office is the best resource to start as far as finding out what types of aid at that institution may be available to your student and family. Now, as you're filling out the FAFSA form, you may run across some unusual or special circumstances. And so today we just wanted to touch upon some of those areas. When we talk about unusual circumstances, we're talking about a situation where the student is unable to contact the parents, or contacting the parents could put them at risk. So it's a situation where the student is not going to be able to rely on the parents for support, even though they're considered a dependent student under the law. And we'll talk more about this, but understand that if the student indicates on the FAFSA form that they're in an unusual circumstance, ultimately the school is going to get that information, and they will work with the student to determine if the circumstances are warranted, what types of documentation might be needed, and ultimately whether or not they're going to approve this particular unusual circumstance. As you can see here, when you're filling out the FAFSA form, there's lots of different areas and topics we collect. There's personal circumstances, demographics, financials, the types of college, the specific colleges that you want the information to go to, etc. As you're filling out this information, there will be an opportunity for you to indicate if there's an unusual circumstance, and ultimately, if some of this information is not an accurate picture of your current financial situation, you will have an opportunity to work with your school under special circumstances, which we'll talk in a little bit. As you're walking through the FAFSA form, remember these 8 tips. Again, get that studentaid.gov account. That's the beginning process. It's going to help speed this process along because you'll be able to sign and submit your documents. Have your documents ready. Have your contributor information ready. Number 4 is very important. We strongly encourage, if you're a dependent student or a student where you're going to have other contributors on your FAFSA form, you, the student, should start the FAFSA. Start your own form, complete your section, and then invite the other contributors to provide their information. We found that that helps speed it along, reduces errors and issues that can arise in the processing of the forms. Read the questions carefully. Some yes, no, some need you to provide specific information. Consult the resources. Well over 99% of our applicants work through the online FAFSA form, and in that process you have chat features, you have help text, links to various documents, document examples to help you in that process. You can always, of course, there's information and articles at studentaid.gov, and you can always call our customer service center that can assist you as well if you have issues with the FAFSA form, and that's at 1-800-4FED-AID, 1-800-433-3243. Don't forget to not review and sign your form, but believe it or not, people forget to submit the form. There is an actual submit button that you will need to do so. And of course, if you make a mistake, don't worry. You will have an opportunity and the ability to correct mistakes or missing information, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So as I was mentioning with unusual circumstances, these are not common. These are pretty rare circumstances, thankfully, because it means that there's not a great situation with the student and the parent. But again, we're talking about a situation where you have an otherwise dependent student. Per our rules, who normally we would ask for parental information, but because of specific issues and circumstances they're dealing with, we don't want to provide the parental information. Maybe there's abandonment, abuse, incarceration, etc., and we can't rely on the parents to provide that information for and support the student. So again, in the FAFSA process, a student is going to be asked a question: do you have an unusual circumstance where you can't reach out to your parents or it's not safe to do so? If they indicate yes, when the school gets the information, the school is going to request specific documentation to support that circumstance. Every circumstance is unique. The school must review the information, and they will work with that student on a case-by-case basis. Some examples of unusual circumstances here listed. You can see abandonment, I've already mentioned that, or estrangement. There might be some immigration issues, parental incarceration, incapacitation. Again, not common situations that come up. And these are not this is not an exhaustive list. You can see on the right-hand side, though, please keep in mind that there are some common situations that arise that sometimes families assume would rise to the level of an unusual circumstance, or what we often call as a dependency override, making a dependent student independent. But in fact, these common situations do not allow the schools to create an unusual circumstance for that student. If parents simply refuse to contribute to the student's education, or they're not willing to provide FAFSA information, or they don't claim the student on their income tax, or the student is self-sufficient. These types of scenarios are common, but they don't rise to the level of unusual, and they don't cause a dependency override. Remember what I said up front. Simply providing information on the FAFSA form does not obligate anyone to provide resources to support the student while they're in school. It's simply gathering data so we can get a clear picture of the overall financial strength of the family and determine what types and forms and amounts of financial aid the student can receive. It's not going to obligate anybody else. So as the student is filling out the FAFSA form, if they believe they have an unusual circumstance, there's going to be a question where they can say, yes, I have this unusual circumstance. I can't rely on my parents. There's a potential issue there. The information in an output document will be sent to the school. They'll see this. They're going to reach out to you. You can also reach out to the school. They're going to ask for documentation. There needs to be support of what is the situation. This is where professional judgment comes into play with an institution, where they have the ability to review the situation and make a judgment call. And the authority rests with the institution. They will review your documentation and determine if, in fact, they need to make your dependency status independent. If they do approve you, you will be an independent student. While they're evaluating this, when you indicate that there's an unusual circumstance, we consider you to be provisionally independent. And you're provisionally independent because ultimately the school has to make a decision. If the school approves you as an independent student under this situation, as long as nothing changes and there's no conflicting information, then from year to year while you stay at that school, you will continue to be in that unusual circumstance. You will continue to be considered an independent student. Now remember, just because you check yes that there's an unusual circumstance doesn't mean, in fact, that the school will approve it. If based upon the documentation and the information provided, the school could say, we do not approve, and therefore we still consider you to be dependent. If that's the case, parental information will need to be provided ultimately for that FAFSA form to get fully processed and for a student aid index to be produced so that schools can ultimately determine the types of federal aid you're eligible for and the amounts. Here you can see on this slide the actual question that pops up on the FAFSA form, again asking if there's an unusual circumstance, giving some examples of that, and as we mentioned, they would indicate yes or no. Again, most students, thankfully, are not in this situation, so this is not very common, but it's there, and the law was designed to work with those students who are in these type situations to help them. Here on this slide, you can see a variety of different types of resources that can be used to help support your unusual circumstance. Remember, the school is going to have a policy in place. They're going to ask for information, and they'll give you some ideas of the type of documentation needed. Here you can see interviews, statements, third-party documents, court documents. There's not one document or types of document that must be used, because every situation is different, and we won't know, or the school won't know, what's necessarily needed until they review your situation case by case. But all these types of documentation could be utilized. Sometimes they'll ask for more information. And so continue to work with your school to work through this particular unusual circumstance request for them to make a final decision. So unusual circumstances are focused on dependency, right? That's where a dependent student would become independent. Whereas now we also have special circumstances or special financial circumstances. And this is where the school has the ability to adjust data elements on the FAFSA form and or components within your cost of attendance, which may or may not increase access to types and amounts of federal financial aid. Remember that the FAFSA form that you're filling out, whether it's 2425, 2526, it's a snapshot. It's gathering data as of a particular point in time. So you can see on this particular slide, we say for 2526, you're going to use tax information from 2023. If it's 2425, you're looking at 2022 tax information. I point that out because 2 years or more could go by the time you're applying for aid at your institution in a particular award year. It's possible situations have changed. People have lost jobs, jobs have changed. Maybe there's been a reduction in salary. Maybe there's some types of unexpected costs that your family is dealing with because of personal situations that have arisen. So whether it's financial, tax information, asset information, which by the way is current as of when you're filling out the FAFSA form. But again, what are some of those assets tied to? How might they be utilized within your family situation? You have the ability to ask the financial aid office to review your special circumstance to see if they will approve an adjustment based upon your circumstances. So as you're filling out the FAFSA form, when it comes to special circumstances, there is no question on the form like there is for unusual circumstances. You need to fill out the FAFSA form with all of the most complete and accurate information as you can. Then, if you feel you have a special circumstance, you want to reach out to your institution and tell them about your circumstance. The schools are going to have a process in place, a policy in place. They have to have information shared with all prospective students and current students to let them know that this professional judgment, that this ability to potentially adjust items on the FAFSA form or cost of attendance is available to them. And they have to review all requests. Does not mean they have to approve all requests. So I stress that as well. Ultimately, the school will make that decision under their professional judgment whether to approve or not approve the request that's being made, again, based upon the information provided, the documentation, the circumstances, etc. So it's important to know you fill out the complete FAFSA and then you're going to approach the school if you feel you have an issue. Again, like unusual circumstances, there's a lot of different types of supporting documentation. You can see here examples of pay stubs, medical bills, etc., that might be used, again, depending on your situation. Do you have high medical costs that are outside, not covered by insurance, and it's a recurring issue, and a lot of the discretionary funds that you might appear to have access to are actually going towards these unforeseen medical situations, and you want the school to be aware of that, and maybe they can adjust income or other types of data elements on the FAFSA form that might give you access to more need-based aid or larger amounts of federal aid. So these types of documentation, again, it's case by case. There's not one type of document that will be used in all cases. It depends on your situation. School process and policies, they may have websites, forms, links, and individuals that they may want you to talk to that specialize in working with students who have unusual or special circumstances. Again, this slide just mentions again the difference between unusual, which is focused on dependency status, and special financial circumstances, which is focusing on FAFSA data element adjustments or cost of attendance. Remember, on the unusual circumstance side, I do need to point out that you're going to have a list of questions on the FAFSA form, and it's going to ask you, first of all, based upon your age. If you're under 24 as of a certain beginning of a calendar year, you would be dependent. But we'll ask, are you a veteran? Are you a graduate student? Are you married and not separated? Were you orphaned and or emancipated? So there's lots of different questions we're going to ask the student. And if you answer yes to any of those dependency questions, then you would become independent. But if you can't answer yes to any of them, then you're dependent unless you have an unusual circumstance, as we talked about earlier. And so I kept using the word professional judgment. Professional judgment is the financial aid authority to make adjustments to your FAFSA elements, to the cost of attendance, to ultimately make a decision based upon your circumstances and the information provided, and make their professional judgment on whether to approve or not approve the adjustments based on the circumstances and the information provided. So you can see here sort of some key points in that process. The school is going to has the ability, doesn't mean they will, but they have the ability to adjust the elements, to make decisions regarding the various circumstances we talked about. But they have to review the information. They have to do so on a case-by-case basis. They need the documentation. Ultimately, they're going to make a final decision. That decision is their decision. It's not appealable to the Department of Education. The law, Higher Education Act, has given the financial aid administrators, the institutions that you attend, the authority to make these decisions. So as long as they're following their policies, as long as they're collecting the information required and following our guidelines, their decision is going to stand. And so I just stress with that because students talk, and someone may have a friend who got some data elements adjusted, and then you try to do something and the school denied you. But understand, every situation is different. Everything is case by case, and you don't know what they saw or didn't see and how they evaluated the particular situations as they're being presented to the school officials. And remember that if they do approve your unusual or special circumstance adjustments, understand that that may impact the aid you receive. Now, most of the time, people assume it's going to increase the aid or the types of need-based aid, maybe more need-based aid they can get, and that may be true, but it doesn't always work out that way, and I stress that, especially with dependency overrides or the unusual circumstances. Students often think, oh, to be independent, that's the gold standard. If I'm independent, I'm going to get the most aid, the most need-based aid that I could get. Not always true. I know many independent students who make a decent amount of money and have been working for the last couple of years. And if they were to be independent, they actually may have a higher student aid index and get less need-based aid than if their parent was on the FAFSA form. If your parents' financial situation is such that they're currently struggling or in a lower income than what the student may be independently, believe it or not, you may get more aid as that dependent student than you would as an independent student. So just keep all of those things in mind as you're looking at your situation and trying to make those judgment calls. Now, obviously, if you have to go through an unusual circumstance because you can't rely on your parents, then of course you would have to do that. But just keep in mind adjustments, how it may or may not impact your aid. Now, I mentioned as you're filling out the FAFSA form, you filled out your FAFSA form, you have your confirmation page. Congratulations, it's been submitted. It gives you an estimate on what your student aid index will be, which is your eligibility indicator that schools will utilize when determining the amounts and types of federal aid you will receive. It will give you estimated amounts of types of aid. But understand that after you've done all that and you have taken a look at your FAFSA submission summary, which is an output document sent to the student that you have access to that summarizes all the data on the FAFSA form, you may realize that there's been a mistake or data's missing, or you need to update something that was incorrect. You have the ability to do that. One thing I want to point out about the FAFSA submission summary, which, by the way, for those of you who may have filled out several FAFSA forms over the last couple of years, it used to be called the SAR, or the Student Aid Report. It is now called the FAFSA Submission Summary, basically the same output document, but it provides your student aid index. It provides a summary of the information that you provided. It will not have any federal tax information that was transferred over by the IRS on the FAFSA Submission Summary. And I just point that out because that's a security issue. We're trying to protect the data, and so it's not going to appear on the FAFSA submission summary. Again, we assume the tax filer who provided that information to us, the consent, would have access to their own tax data, so we don't need to present it to them. Understand that the FAFSA submission summary is not a financial aid award letter. It is not an aid offer. So any estimates we provide are just that, estimates. To get a clear picture of the types of aid you're going to be eligible for, that offer is going to come from your institution that you're applying to, your school you're applying to. And it's not only going to have federal aid, but also often we'll talk about state, school, and private aid that they're aware of when they make that offer to you. One of the nice things about studentaid.gov, and again, I'm stressing that website, that is your electronic library. That is your resource that you need to become familiar with for federal student aid. When you go to studentaid.gov, you sign in, right, with your username and password. Ultimately, when you go to your activity or your dashboard and you click on the actual FAFSA form in question, 2526 or the 2425, you'll get to see the status of your form. Is it in progress? If it's in progress, it means it hasn't been submitted. If you thought you submitted it, you need to go in and submit it. If there's an action required, if maybe a signature is missing or consent and approval, we will let you know, and that you or your other contributor needs to go in to provide that needed information. So it's a great resource to see where that form is. As far as corrections, you go to studentaid.gov, you're going to log in with your FSA ID. Here you can see on this screen the dashboard I was talking about. Down at the bottom, you can see under My Activity, you're going to see your FAFSA forms by award year, so make sure you click on the correct one. And when you get to the details page, you can see when did it start, was it processed. Here you can pull up your FAFSA submission summary, so you can see that summary of data. If you go to the upper right-hand corner, you'll see an action menu. When you click on that, you can add schools, you can edit contributor information, but you can also make corrections. When you start the make correction process, we're going to onboard you, reminding you, hey, do you really want to do this? Because honestly, you should only be making corrections if something's missing or incorrect, or the school has specifically told you to go in and change something in the correction process. And that's because When these corrections go through, it's very possible your aid is going to change. Your eligibility for types of aid will change. And so you want to make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. When you click continue, you're going to then obtain a correction type page. Do you want to adjust or add schools that you want information from the FAFSA sent to? Do you want to update specific FAFSA question data? Do you want to update contributor information? In this example, the student wanted to update some specific sections within the FAFSA itself. And so you get the summary page, and you can see here the block of data. And so you would then start going into the sections where you want to update the information. Go ahead, make those corrections, and then you'll get to a correction review changes page. And this is a very important page because, as you can see here, it's going to show you what was my original data, what was the data changed to, and you have the ability to edit it. You know, maybe you realize, oh, that wasn't the line item I thought I was going to change. I meant to do something else. Well, you can go back in and correct that. Once everything looks good, you hit continue. You do have to sign again. And the reason you have to sign is you're attesting that the updated information is correct and true to the best of your knowledge, right? Again, go forward, sign it, and then it will get submitted. You'll get another confirmation page indicating that, in fact, the information, the corrected information has been submitted. That will get processed. You'll get another FAFSA submission summary. Your school will get more output documents with the corrected information. Just a couple of scenarios we put in here based upon some of the information we shared today. If you were asked, which of the following is an unusual circumstance? Is it abandonment? Is it parents unwilling to complete the FAFSA? Or loss of a job? Or all of the above? Hopefully, if I did a good enough job based on the information prior, we remember that unusual circumstances are not common, and it's specifically used to determine dependency status for a student. Are we going to make a dependent student independent? The answer for this is abandonment, right? It's a situation where we can't rely on the parents to provide support. We can't reach the parents, or the parents potentially there's a risk if the student tries to reach out to the parent. True or false? If a student submits a FAFSA form, can they be considered independent even if they're under the age of 24? Typically, a student is considered independent if they are 24 at the beginning of a particular calendar year. As you can see, and that's under the law. So I point that out to my families out there today because 24 seems kind of old in some situations. But that's why some of you are surprised sometimes when it's like, well, how could my child still be considered dependent? He's 21, he's 22. It's because the law states you have to be 24 or older or meet other criteria, as I had mentioned. Can a student be independent and under 24? Yes, they can. Under the unusual circumstances, if it does rise to that situation, you could be a provisionally independent student, and ultimately, if approved by the school, you can be independent even if you're under 24. And also, if you answer yes to any of the dependency questions, you know, active duty, maybe the student's married, not separated, maybe they have a child that lives with them and that they're providing more than 50% support. So again, there's a list of questions that we're going to ask to determine if they're independent or not. And again, if they answer yes to any of those, even if they're under 24, they could end up being an independent student. What about acceptable forms of documentation for special or unusual circumstances? Can it be statements from family members, statements from staff, school staff, courts or legal documents, or all of the above? Any one of these specific ones are specific to special or unusual circumstances? The answer, as we pointed out, all of the above. Every case is going to be different. Every case has to be individually reviewed by the institution. It's case by case, and there's no one set form or document that must be used in all situations because it's unique to that particular situation. Mark completed the 25-26 FAFSA in February. He learned that his mother lost her job in 2024. But he'd already completed the 25-26 FAFSA form, so he decided to just leave it as is. Is this the right thing for Mark? I might not even call it the right thing, but is it the smart thing? Because everything he provided is correct. The FAFSA form was filled out correctly. Remember, the income information is 2 years back for 25-26. He would have used his mother's information from 2023. But maybe he's had a life circumstance come in that if the school was to review it, maybe it would alter it. So it may not be the smart thing for Mark, because the financial aid office, in reviewing his family situation, may be able to adjust some of those data elements, which may allow Mark to get more types of federal financial aid, especially need-based aid, that could assist them in this issue. Again, that's assuming the mother's still unemployed, or the job, there was a reduction in income or whatever. Again, every situation has to be evaluated, but Mark should be aware that when that comes up, he would have the ability to work with his institution. And finally, we have Mary, a U.S. national, lives in the U.S., but the parents live in Canada. She doesn't have contact with them. In fact, she can't contact them because there's some safety risk to her for various reasons. She was told by somebody that, well, all you're going to be able to get in that situation is an unsubsidized loan. Was that the correct answer for her? And of course, as we spent some time on, the answer would be no. This could rise to the level of an unusual circumstance. Based upon the documentation and information provided to the school, in evaluating it, they may determine that in fact Mary is in an unusual circumstance, and they might want to do a dependency override, taking her from dependent to independent. If you become independent, if the dependency override occurs, you check the box that there's an unusual circumstance. Remember, we're going to suppress the requirement to provide parental information. Therefore, the student does not need to obtain and interact that. And if it's ultimately approved by the school, they will then become independent. Just a few resources to keep in mind. Again, a lot of these are on studentaid.gov. We have a federal student aid estimator. Any student, any age, this is often good for high school students starting to think about college, students currently in school. What types of federal financial aid might I be eligible for? Well, this is an estimator that can help with that. Again, it estimates. It is not the FAFSA form. You would actually have to fill that out to truly determine what you're going to be eligible for. For anyone that's borrowed federal student loans, consider looking at the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Help Tool, or PSLF. Unfortunately, loans have become a necessary requirement often for students to go to college and obtain degrees and certificates. But for those that end up working in the public sector, for governments, nonprofits, you may be able to get some of your loan forgiven after a 10-year period. So take a look at that if you have loans or thinking about getting loans. Again, I already mentioned the wizard to determine or help determine which parent or parent information that should be listed on the FAFSA form. Again, that's located at studentaid.gov. Fred mentioned early on, there's a YouTube channel. So recordings of sessions like this and other sessions you can find at the link provided. For instance, if you had questions about, well, how do I obtain or walk through a studentaid.gov account? I have some questions about that. We have training on that, and you can find that on our YouTube channel. If we have any guidance counselors out there or other college access professionals, don't forget there's a financial aid toolkit that you can utilize in working with students and parents as you help prepare them for college, career and trade schools, training, PowerPoints, materials, links, contacts, etc. We have checklists out there for our students and parents especially for all ages. So how do I even begin starting to save for college, for elementary, middle school, high school? What are the different challenges and resources out there? And at the different school level or age level, it can be important to know the steps that can help prepare for college. Again, for our partners out there, If you want to receive updates and reminders for those professionals that are working with their families and students, we encourage you to sign up for our reminders. There's the QR code there and link. We periodically send out emails that talk about upcoming products, modifications to services, enhancements, and so forth. So that's a great resource for our partners. And finally, for everybody out there, again, studentaid.gov for my students and families, that's going to be your main resource. But you can see here in this very technologically advanced world, there's lots of different social media platforms out there, Instagram, Facebook, etc., that you have access to, that we continuously update and provide information to assist our students and families. Wow. Well, that was a lot of information. We hope that was beneficial. I'm now going to turn it over back to Fred Stennis, who is going to review a few of the questions we may have received and provide some feedback information and any wrap up. Take it away, Fred.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, David. That was an outstanding presentation, very informative. I hope all our parents and families and students saw that as a very rewarding topic and presentation today. Let's get to a couple of questions. We've got a few questions we can get to. Maybe David can give us some assistance and guidance on those questions. David, we have one question where a parent really is concerned about, a student who's concerned about a parent who's unwilling to assist them on the FAFSA. Any advice or direction you might give that student, David, about what they can do or what that might mean or impact, whether it be Title IV federal aid or state aid or institutional aid, with the student not or the parent not engaging? Any advice,
Sure.
David?
Sure, Fred. And unfortunately, we do hear about this from time to time. And that's why I kept stressing. And if it hasn't been stressed, I hope the student and the school potentially can act on behalf of the student as well and help the parent understand that just providing that information in no way obligates them to provide funding to the student. I know there are parents out there, as soon as you reach a certain age, you're on your own. I'm not providing for college. But remember that the information is simply used to help determine the types of aid the student will receive. There is no obligation for that. So hopefully that might help. Also, all the data is protected under FERPA, Privacy Act. Sometimes parents are reluctant. So, those things can help as well. And of course, work with your financial aid office, explain the situation. They've seen this many, many times, and they may have some information or ways that they can help the family, maybe sit down and talk to them and walk through this process.
Good advice. Good advice. Here's one. What if the dependent student's parents is out of work? Maybe at the time they completed the FAFSA form, their situation was one thing financially, and then it changed. Does this qualify as an unusual circumstance?
So if the parents are unemployed at the time they're filling out the FAFSA form, as I mentioned, you do have to provide your income information 2 years back. It's a prior snapshot. However, this would fall under potentially special circumstances. You're still a dependent student. Your parents still in the picture. You still have a great relationship with them. It's just that their financials, unfortunately, right now, they're struggling a bit. So if it's not appropriate potentially to use their 2023 income because they're unemployed, that's where the student wants to indicate to the school that they would like them to consider a professional judgment to evaluate the parent's financial situation because there's been a loss of income. And that's where the school will ask for unemployment information, documentation supporting the change in income, and they'll be able to potentially adjust the income down because of this loss of income, which then will hopefully allow the student to receive more need-based aid or larger amounts of need-based aid. So that would fall under special circumstances.
Okay, thank you very much. Here's a question where a parent has triplets going to school, and she wants to know how the FAFSA form takes that into account, or if it does at all, the fact that they're all going to college at the same time. Do they each need their own separate FAFSA form?
Great question, Fred. Yes. So every FAFSA form is individual for a student. So each of the students, each of the triplets will fill out their own FAFSA form. They will all invite, the parent will provide information for each of those FAFSA forms as well. And consent and approval will be provided. We will pull in the data. We will connect the contributor to those three FAFSA forms so the data can be input from the IRS. So it does reduce some of that duplication because of that. But yes, the key is, and everyone needs their own studentaid.gov account and fill out their form properly that way. The number in college no longer directly, we will ask for it, but it no longer directly impacts the student aid index. Family size does get factored in though, so we do look at your family size. And again, if you have any special or unusual circumstances, well, not unusual, but special circumstances because of unusual costs or something, they would be able to work with the financial aid office as well.
That'll work. Just a couple more, time for a couple more. Here's a case that seems like a parent is divorced and her ex-husband has already filled out the FAFSA form. And she was told that herself and her daughter need to fill out their own forms as well. Is that true? And I'm not sure if she's referring to the FAFSA form or the studentaid.gov account. But how does she address that?
So in a divorce situation with a dependent student, that's where that wizard's going to come in really helpful on studentaid.gov. But we're primarily going to look at which parent provides more financial support. And in most situations, that should be fairly self-evident, though we know sometimes it may be really close to that 50-50, and there may be concerns about that. If that's the case, then we're going to tell you in our help articles and so forth to put the parent that has the largest income and assets available. So it's just because a parent specifically filled out a FAFSA, again, doesn't necessarily mean that's the correct parent. We want to make sure we do have the right parent. But if in a divorce setting, the father, for instance, was the parent who needed to provide support, then the mother would never have to provide her information. It would just be one or the other parent in a divorce situation. Now, if the parent who's divorced is the parent who's providing their contributing information on the form is remarried, then it's also possible some step-parent information may need to be provided. But again, if the mother is not going to be considered the parent that needs to contribute information, then no, the mother would not need to fill out their own FAFSA, would not need to get a studentaid.gov account, etc. If that mother either wants to go to school herself, then yes, she would get her own account and fill out her own form.
Very, very helpful. We got time for one more, David. Here's a situation. It sounds like a special situation where a parent is in a coma, induced coma. This is a student writing on behalf of their parent. What advice or direction or guides would you give to help them resolve the issues they may run into about getting the parents' information on the FAFSA form? Is that something they need to contact the school about? What steps would you recommend they take?
Yeah, I would definitely reach out to the institution. You could also, again, reach out to 1-800-4FED-AID, our customer service group that works with students and families. That's unfortunately a situation I hope turns around, but there are definitely times where parents are incapacitated. Depending on, what the other parent situation is, we could have a potential unusual circumstance, but we could also have a situation where we can still obtain that information. Someone else potentially can sign for that parent through a power of attorney. And we do have a process for that where the power of attorney would need to be, the documentation would be submitted along with the FAFSA and so forth. So again, if you have very unique situations like that, start with your institution, but also feel free to call the 1-800 number because there are certain steps we can take to work through that unique situation.
Okay, thank you so much, David. And that's going to pretty much end today's Q&A session and today's webinar. Again, I want to thank you and everyone for joining in this webinar and taking a few moments to use our QR code on the screen to provide your questions and some important feedback. So I want to again thank you all for participating in that. And remember to visit our YouTube channel within 24 hours at FSA Outreach for a recording of today's webinar. So the recording will be posted there. A copy of today's PowerPoint slides can be requested or obtained and made available from the description area on our channel. So you'll click on the request for a PowerPoint under the description section of this YouTube recording once it's posted, and you can get a copy of the PowerPoint slides there. So again, thank you, David, for doing such a dynamic job. We appreciate your effort, and thank everyone for taking the time to join in. We hope this has been helpful, and we're going to sign off right now and hope you have a blessed day. Good evening.